The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and the bright studio lights beamed down onto the glossy surface of the interview desk. Millions of viewers across the country tuned in, expecting just another night of lively debate and heated exchanges. But what they were about to witness would become one of the most talked about moments in television history. At the center of it all sat James Carter, a self-made black entrepreneur whose groundbreaking tech company had been making waves in the business world. His company had started from humble beginnings, just an idea scribbled on a notepad in his small apartment. Now, it was worth millions, employing hundreds of people and revolutionizing the industry. He had been invited onto The Real Truth with Mark Reynolds, a widely known talk show hosted by one of the most controversial media figures in the country. Mark Reynolds had built his career on being provocative. His interviews were often less about genuine discussion and more about cornering his guests, poking at them until they slipped up or lost their composure. His audience loved him for it. He had a particular reputation when it came to certain guests, especially successful minorities. Many accused him of having a habit of talking down to them, dismissing their achievements, and twisting narratives to fit his own biased views. James knew exactly what he was walking into. He wasn't naive. He had seen the clips, read the headlines, and heard the stories of how previous guests had been ambushed with loaded questions and underhanded remarks. But he also knew something else. He wasn't the kind of man to back down. He didn't rise to success by letting people define him. And he certainly wasn't about to let Mark Reynolds do it tonight. From the moment James stepped onto the stage, he could feel the energy in the room. The audience, though mostly neutral, had their fair share of Mark's devoted fans. They were waiting for fireworks, waiting for their host to pick his target apart. Mark welcomed him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "James Carter, welcome to the show. Quite the success story you have, huh? A rare one, I'd say." James smiled, already seeing where this was going. "Thanks for having me, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work." Mark leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Let's talk about that. You built a tech company from nothing, you say. Quite impressive, especially considering, well, let's just say the statistics aren't exactly in favor of people like you succeeding in this industry." There it was. The first jab, subtle but clear. James maintained his calm. "People like me? You mean people who work hard, innovate, and refuse to accept limitations?" "Yeah, I'd say the odds were against me, but that's what makes success all the more satisfying." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. No. I mean, let's be honest here, James. The tech world is a tough place for black entrepreneurs. Some might even say it's not really your lane. Wouldn't you agree that certain industries are naturally more suited to certain groups of people?" A murmur went through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, waiting for James's reaction. James took a slow breath, keeping his expression unreadable. He had expected something like this, but hearing it said out loud, on national television, was still jarring. He could already see how Mark was trying to frame the conversation, trying to lead him into a defensive position. But James wasn't about to play that game. Instead of reacting with outrage, instead of getting pulled into a heated argument, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. A smile so calm, so confident, that for the first time that night, Mark looked just a little uneasy. James then spoke, his words measured, deliberate, and with just a few sentences, he would turn the entire interview on its head. What he said next would leave the audience in stunned silence, send shockwaves across social media, and change the way people saw Mark Reynolds forever. James let the silence linger, letting the weight of Mark's words settle in the air. The audience was waiting, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark, usually the one in control, leaned slightly forward, as if trying to read James's expression, trying to anticipate his response. But James was in no hurry. He took his time, adjusting his cufflinks, flashing an easy smile. And then, in a voice steady and composed, he finally spoke. "You know, Mark," he said, "I find it fascinating when people talk about lanes, as if innovation, intelligence, and ambition have boundaries, as if success has a color-coded map. He let the words sink in, then added, I didn't ask for permission to be here. I didn't wait for a lane to be cleared for me. I built my own. The audience reacted before Mark could. A few scattered claps, some murmurs. The energy in the room shifted, subtle but noticeable. Mark, ever the seasoned host, recovered quickly, forcing a chuckle. Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, he said, his fingers drumming against the desk. But let's be realistic. There are facts and figures. We can't ignore that certain industries have been historically dominated by certain groups. Tech, for instance. It's not exactly known for diversity. Some might argue that there's a reason for that. James tilted his head, as if he found the statement amusing. Oh, there's a reason, all right. But it's not the one you're implying. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. You see, success isn't about where you come from. It's about what you bring to the table. And in my experience, talent doesn't discriminate. Opportunity does. That landed. A ripple went through the crowd. Mark's smile tightened for just a second before he masked it with another laugh. Now that's an interesting take, he said, his voice smooth but with an edge. So you're saying that if more people like you had opportunities, we'd see a drastic shift in the industry? James didn't miss the phrasing. People like you. He could have responded with frustration, but he knew better. That's what Mark wanted. An emotional reaction. Something he could twist into a headline. Something his viewers could latch onto. Instead, James leaned in slightly, his confidence unwavering. I'm saying that when barriers are removed, talent rises, period. You look at history. You see it time and time again. How many times have people doubted those who didn't fit the mold only to be proven wrong? He gave a small shrug, his voice casual but firm. The problem isn't that there's a lack of talent from people like me. The problem is that for a long time, people in power, people like you, Mark, preferred to pretend we didn't exist. The room went still. Mark's jaw tightened just a little before he forced another smile. Well, I wouldn't say James didn't. Let him finish. And yet, here I am, he said smoothly. Despite the odds. Despite the statistics you love so much. So the real question, Mark, is why does that bother you so much? The audience reacted again. A low murmur, shifting in their seats. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Mark, the man who had made a career out of putting others on the defensive, was now the one being pressed. Mark let out another forced chuckle, trying to regain control. Oh, it doesn't bother me, he said, waving a hand dismissively. I'm just asking the tough questions. That's my job, isn't it? James gave him a knowing smile. It's funny, though. You didn't ask the last guest why he thought he belonged in his industry. You didn't question whether he was in the right lane. He let the words hang, then added, Why is that, Mark? Mark's face twitched for just a moment. He knew he was losing ground. I ask all my guests tough questions, he said smoothly. It's not personal. James chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I'm sure it isn't. The room was silent again, the tension almost unbearable. Even the audience, who had come expecting an entirely different dynamic, now found themselves caught in the shift of power. Mark was used to steering the narrative, used to putting his guests on the back foot. But James had done something unexpected. He had turned the mirror around, and Mark didn't like what he saw. The host cleared his throat, forcing another smile as he shuffled his notes. Well, James, he said, it's clear you have a strong perspective. But let's switch gears for a second. Your company, there have been rumors that some of your success came from, let's say, government assistance programs. Would you say that's true? James knew what Mark was doing. It was a classic move. When one angle didn't work, switch to another. Try to discredit him in a different way. James folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. I find it interesting how successful Black entrepreneurs always get asked that question. as if the only way we can succeed is with a handout. Yet, when a billionaire tech mogul gets tax breaks, subsidies, and government contracts, it's just good business. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. I built my company with my own hands. Every investor, every deal, every late night. I made that happen. No shortcuts, no handouts. But it's funny how when people like me make it, suddenly there has to be an explanation, right? It can't just be that we're smart, that we worked hard, that we deserve to be here. More murmurs from the audience. A few nodded. Even some of Mark's loyal viewers were beginning to feel the weight of what was happening. Mark exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated now. James, I'm just trying to get to the truth here, he said, his voice tighter than before. James raised an eyebrow. Are you? The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. And Mark, for the first time in a long time, didn't seem to have an answer. The cameras kept rolling. The audience was silent, waiting. They could all feel it. This was no ordinary interview. Something bigger was happening here. James Carter had walked into the studio expecting a fight. But what he had done was far more powerful. He had exposed something real, something uncomfortable. And now, the whole world was watching.